Kevin Lynch was somebody who had an impact on my early career, and so I thought, well, let's tell the story of what's happened from my perspective. And the story will take us from Scotland to England and New England. Now, Kevin Lynch is probably best known for this book, The Image of the City, which is about imageability, and as far as I know, that book was the first time that word appeared. And he said, a legible cityscape possesses a high degree of imageability. And I thought that sentence reads equally well if you say an imageable city has a high degree of legibility. So there's a conundrum. So it was Lynch's seminal book on the perceptual reading of the city. I thought that was a nice description. That's from a blog from Manchester University. It was essentially an empirical study of how people perceive their city. It identifies a common or community image of the city as well. And he believed that that image can help to lead to an improvement in the image of the city. In other words, some kind of normative value can be placed on it. So, imageability, at the time, a new word and perhaps a new endeavour. I'm not aware of other people attempting what he attempted before. So basically he set out to be able to categorise the image of the city in a way that people could understand and respond to. And this image was included in the flyer for this talk. And this categorization of elements of the image of the city consists of the path, the edge, the node, the landmark, and the district. I'll say a little bit about those things. This legibility study that he undertook of Boston, he actually did 3 cities, but in Boston, he labelled or drew up graphics for the city of Boston based on how frequently different elements of the city were mentioned by the people that he interviewed and worked with. So the darker the graphic, the more frequent was the mentioning. Now, don't get too put off by this. In the bottom right is an image of the city as prepared by trained researchers and surveyors, and so trained by Lynch, one should say. And on the top left was the image of the city as revealed in interviews with the various participants of the study. Bottom left was the image of the city as revealed when those people were asked to sketch their city. And top right is what Lynch considers to be the essential elements of Boston. How many have been to Boston? Hands up? Oh, quite a few. Okay. So there are certain common elements that appear in all of those. For example, the state house with this wonderful golden dome, and Boston Common. Everybody seems to focus on that, and the wonderful Ave, Commonwealth Avenue, which is extremely legible, broad and distinctive. But look at this one. In the objective view of Boston, the south end, these diagrams are tilted, so that's the orange is south. It's clearly there as a district, Boston South End. But look what happens. In the interviews, people could say, yes, there was a Boston South End, but they had a great deal of difficulty in locating it in relation to the other elements. In the key elements, there's one bit of it that could be said to be distinctive, but the remainder of it is just a somewhat amorphous urban environment. And when people were asked to draw their image of Boston, that South End disappears. So, having done all of the study, Lynch then produced this diagram, which showed what he considered had been revealed to be the image problems of Boston. So we can't go through all that, obviously, but there's things like, if you look at the Boston Common, which is that rectangle in plumb centre of that diagram, Boston Common, if anybody has attempted to navigate without a map, it's extremely difficult because it looks like a rectangle, but it's actually a five-sided common, and people are continually getting their orientation wrong as a result of that. And there's other problems like lack of definition, which is definitely in the south side. It's an area without a clear boundary and without clear differentiation within it. So people find it very hard to say what is unique or special about it. Okay, so at the same time in the UK, there were a few people who were beginning also to think about the image of the city. And I've drawn attention here to two people, Gordon Cullen, who wrote the book Townscape in 1961, exactly the same time as Image of the City, and perhaps slightly less well known, but further along in his career by that point, Thomas Sharpe, who, I don't know, I liked. He wrote a nice book on town planning, and he wrote this nice one on anatomy of village, wonderful little drawings, and it's very personal and very attractive, and that appealed to me in my early studies. So how did Lynch, I'm including Gordon Cullen because, to be honest, I can't really remember whose influence was what. How did they inspire me? Well, for me, I had a sort of excitement in me about, moving through the city and the urban environment. And, as a teenager, an early student and so on, I didn't really think other than I like cities. That was all I knew, really. And when I read these books, it suddenly occurred to me, I became aware of the fact that my excitement was due to various elements which could be explained and codified, and ranked or whatever. So it was nice to have a bit of shape to put on what for me was really more gut feelings. And it led me directly to a number of specific projects. And I'm going to mention a few of these, partly because I've dug them out of my archive and I haven't looked at them for 50 years. And it's rather nice for me to have an excuse to present them in this context. So, saving natural stone paving in Edinburgh, doing an analysis of the townscape of Berwick-on-Tweed, and campaigning and working to conserve important townscape in Glasgow and Covent Garden, Piccadilly Circus, a number of others. And also fighting, as was mentioned in the introduction, fighting the introduction of motorways, particularly in Edinburgh, Glasgow and London. So, first one, stone paving. In the mid-1960s, this is where I lived. This is the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. And in 1967, the City Council, in its wisdom, was busy ripping up the 19th century granite stones from the Royal Mile and replacing it with asphalt. And me and my brother, who both lived in the Royal Mile, we felt this was entirely wrong. We were outraged. To me, this, coming from suburban Kent, where I grew up, an environment like this was to me like arriving in heaven. There you are, all the elements you could want. Okay, consistent frontages, consistent materials or compatible materials, the landmark there of the Tron Church, the long view out to further forth, and Holyrood Palace Park. Just a wonderful place to live. You step out feeling a bit groggy after a night out, and in the morning, and the environment can lift your spirits and inspire you for the day. I didn't want to see it destroyed by city engineers' vandalism. So we mounted a campaign, SOS, Save Our Sets. This was a poster we plastered all over the shop. We managed to get virtually all of the shops in the Royal Mile. It was summer festival time, so thousands of visitors. These posters appeared like a rash all over central Edinburgh. And we also mounted an exhibition called The Floor of the City, where we showed examples from the likes of Florence and Venice and so on of how natural stone contributes to the overall appearance. And in fact, this was a very successful campaign. The lower part of the Royal Mile had already been asphalted. There was nothing we could do about that. But the upper part, the sets were saved, and in fact, they were not only saved, but eventually they were relaid. And quite nicely done, and attention to little corner details, and the ramp there you can see in the insert photograph. Ramp's a little bit steep by accessibility standards, but nevertheless some thought had gone into it all. So I feel very pleased that you can still go to Edinburgh and enjoy this aspect of the city. I'd just like to mention in passing that there was, in mounting this exhibition called Floor of the City, we needed some money to hire the venue, to pay for the boards and to mount the exhibition. And we went to the chairman of the Edinburgh Pedestrians Association. I think Edinburgh was the first city in Britain to have a pedestrians association. Very nice chap called John Gray, and I can clearly remember him saying, when we'd explained what we were doing, opposing the removal of the sets, he said, "Well, I disagree with your campaign. I fundamentally disagree with what you're trying to do here. But I'm very encouraged that young people like yourselves are taking such an interest in the urban environment. And so I'm going to give you some money." Magic. Magic. And so it was. Berwick-on-Tweed I've mentioned. The Department of Transport was proposing to crash through the centre of historic Berwick-on-Tweed with the widening of the A1 trunk road. And I did a townscape analysis of Berwick-on-Tweed, and I used that analysis to speak to the city fathers who were inclined to roll over in the face of the Department of Transport. And I said, look, Berwick is special. People come to Berwick because it's special, and you're supporting this road plan which will destroy the very thing that people have come to see. And, well, don't say I'm personally responsible for the road scheme being killed, but certainly it didn't go ahead. There's an aerial view of Berwick-on-Tweed from the 1960s, and it's immediately apparent that it's extremely consistent in scale. There are a few aberrations, but not much. The medieval environment, pretty much, the street pattern, the scale of the buildings and so on, pretty much unchanged for hundreds of years. And that was the road scheme that the Department of Transport was planning to push through. And there's my townscape analysis. Hand done. It does bear the nod and a wink to Lynchian methodology. Unfortunately, I've lost the key. I've got a photograph of the analysis, I don't have the key. But you can see there nodes and the consistent frontages are solid red lines. I do remember that. Here are key nodes and key paths indicated as well. So that sort of thing. And that sort of enabled, that sort of objective analysis strengthened our ability to argue against the destruction of the centre. So that was Scotland. I now take you to New England, and specifically to New Haven, Connecticut. And there's a loose personal connection between myself and Kevin Lynch, which I shall briefly explain. Kevin Lynch also studied at Yale, but before the war, and from 35 to 36. He hated it. He thought the teaching of architecture at Yale was stuck in the Beaux-Arts period, and he was more interested in contemporary. But nevertheless, he was there. Well, in 1964, he published a book called The View from the Road. Incidentally, other books by Kevin Lynch are on the table there, should you wish to browse later on. He published a book called The View from the Road, my copy of which has long been lost. And that inspired the Connecticut State at the time to commission a study on essentially the view from the road, but they called it Highway as Environment. And the brief, in brief, their argument was, we spend a lot of time talking about, bear in mind they were building a lot of freeways through the state, interurban roads. They said, we spend a lot of time thinking about how the road looks within the landscape. But we ignore the fact that 99% of the people viewing the landscape are doing so from the road. So the project was, how do we plan the alignment and grades of the road and so on to create a nice, a good and interesting view from the road. So that's, in that way, I worked on this study. There's a picture I took of one of my colleagues, Aaron Marcus, who's now a professor at Berkeley and one of the well-known graphic designers, and there's some of the graphics we were working on just behind him there. I need to crack on a bit. The view from the road introduced this idea of sequential vision. Actually, Gordon Cullen had got there first, but it has become quite a well-known aspect of townscape analysis. And view from the road included this diagram, which is not a million miles away from the graphic which you could see on that earlier slide. This idea of the view being influenced by the person passing through. So we compare, for example, the viewing of the environment from a pedestrian who, by virtue of going very slowly, is able to look all around and appreciate more or less 360 degrees vision, and a slow pace. On a freeway, you are constrained by the need to keep your eye ahead so you don't hit what's in front, and also by the nature of the vehicle, which constrains your angle of vision. And so you come up with, on the freeway, with this idea of a visual envelope. So travelling, in this case, left to right, because of the topography and so on, there are limits to how far you can see, and that's just an example. If you travel back in the other direction, you get a slightly different visual envelope, And you can combine the two to get an overall picture, and then you can work on that to, for example, define different character areas. You pass from an urban environment through to rural or industrial or whatever it might be. So, Kevin Lynch, what else did he do? Well, he published a number of books, and there's a selection of them there. Some of them are on the table here. There's one I couldn't find an image of, well, there wasn't room for it, called Wasting Away, which is interesting to pursue. His life's work was, he was a bit of a polymath, really, and in terms of being a city thinker, there wasn't a lot that he didn't consider, certainly from the point of view of the image of the city, the form of cities, how you experience them, how you analyse that form, and had quite an obsession with design theories as well. And I must admit I could never get on with them. But also methods of planning and development, and his book, for example, Site Planning, is really quite an extraordinary document. And in addition to his published works, he also did a lot of projects and visioning utopias and so on. So there's a lot more to Lynch than just the image of the city. Now, I want to move on to the second theme, if you like, which is to look at the context within which Lynch was doing his work. It was a time of thinking about utopian new towns. We think of Frank Lloyd Wright and Corbusier in particular, perhaps. In this country, there was the Garden City movement, and we also had the actual new towns, the post-war new towns. And it was also a period of very extensive freeway and motorway building. There's images there from Cumbernauld in the 1950s, Los Angeles as well. So that was the kind of paradigm, I suppose you might say, within which Lynch was developing his ideas. In other words, an expectation that there would be new townscapes emerging and new ways of moving through townscapes using the car rather than on foot. But it was also a time of inner city decline, which, you know, was pretty much the Western world. Was a Frank Lloyd Wright image from dwellings from the 40s, sadly neglected and inhospitable city environments. So there was this expectation also of comprehensive renewal, rebuilding cities. And there was perhaps a sense in which modernism was coterminous with the idea of idealism. Now, Lynch also studied with Frank Lloyd Wright about 1936-37. There's FLW himself in the centre there, and there on his right is Kevin Lynch. And this is just an aside, but is that the young Marlon Brando there? Mind you, he would have been very young. I think he would have been 12, but another image. So there's this idea, you know, of fantastical flying machines and everybody zooming about in a high-tech way, and big spaces and iconic buildings. This was the kind of thing which, I don't know, it's what architects get up to if they're not restrained. Look at it. Ville radieuse. Dear, oh dear. Anyway, Unité d'habitation, 1952, and our own version of it at Roehampton. So this is, you know, the brave new world, modernism, but I'm calling it brutalism. Now, also at the same time, there were other things going on. 1963, just 2 years after Image of the City, we had the Buchanan Report. Everybody's heard of the Buchanan Report, yeah? Traffic in towns. Which also picked up on this context. Now, Buchanan said, "We are nourishing at immense cost a monster of great potential destructiveness," i.e. the motor vehicle, "and yet we love him dearly." Notice the gender there, him. They're all blokes sat round him, look. Would have been different perhaps if there had been more women. There was Anne McEwen, but he came up... It's often misrepresented, the Buchanan Report. Some people say he presented the choice. We don't have to do this, we can do that instead. But in fact, he was a pretty much committed builder of urban motorways, and the various city studies that he did around the UK, they all came up with major road building proposals. So yes, you could read it a certain way, but basically it was this idea of you can redevelop. Here is West Bloomsbury, an area of 9,000 residents, apart from all the businesses and offices and other things that go on there. Oh, knock it all away. We can lace it with urban motorways, build a deck over the parking and start afresh above. Can you imagine? I mean, Hitler would have been delighted at the scale of destruction involved. And that was the kind of architecture. He wanted to bring sort of what is now Hong Kong, I suppose, into central London. So as far as I was concerned, we were definitely going the wrong way. I don't think I was saying go back, but probably I was saying go forward, but not in the way that was being proposed. Reaction against brutalism. And my biggest inspiration, and this is where we come city image or city life. What I've been talking about is city image, which was very much promoted by Lynch and other like-minded people. And Jane Jacobs came with a completely different set of ideas, coming at it from the other end of the spectrum, looking at it through the lives of people rather than how a place looked. So I must admit, although she wrote it in the same year as Image of the City, I didn't actually get to read it until 5 years later. But when I did, I thought, yes, this is where I want to be. This is the sort of thing that I want to develop and work on. I noticed on YouTube there was a video in which Barack Obama says, "This is a good book." So, Jane Jacobs, her values and designs were really inspirational to me. I've just put in a few things here. Frequent streets and short blocks are valuable. There must be a clear demarcation between public space and private space. The district must serve more than one function. Lively, diverse, intense cities contain the seeds of their own regeneration. Cities are, by definition, full of strangers. There must be eyes upon the street, eyes of the natural proprietors of the street, as she called them, i.e. the people who live there and work there and pass through. The sidewalk must have users on it fairly continuously, night and day. And she said the trust of a city street is formed over time from many, many little public sidewalk contacts. Well, those are just a few ideas. I found them inspirational. There, arrowed, is the house in which she lived when she wrote The Death and Life of American Cities, subtitled The Failure of Planning, or Failure of Town Planning, which I think is an important subtitle. But one has to say, I was actually there 2 weeks ago. And I learnt that that house had just changed hands for $3.5 million. And I went back and had a look at her book, and I thought, I don't think this is quite what she was envisaging. So Greenwich Village, yes, she saved it as a physical environment. It's still a mixed-use environment. It's still very exciting, very urban, but it's not quite the mix in terms of social class and social structure that perhaps it was in the days when she was writing about it. I came across this nice graphic of Jane Jacobs' ideas. You can Google it, James Gulliver Hancock. I thought it was quite a nice idea, because she really looked at many aspects of city life, and that kind of encapsulates some of it. I'm taking you back to Edinburgh now. Now what would you think of this townscape? To me, these buildings date from a mixture from the sort of late 17th century through to the 18th century. I would call that a bit of diverse and coherent townscape. And the Woolpack Inn I felt very attached to. For 2 years, my jazz band played in the Woolpack Inn. So you would think, in today's terms, surely this kind of street is worthy of preservation or conservation. But it was demolished to make way for God knows what. So anyway, I was inspired towards campaigns against urban road building and against comprehensive redevelopment, which spelt the death knell for places like the Woolpack in Edinburgh. And I name and blame, in particular, Percy Johnson Marshall, who was the architect for Edinburgh University. And that diagram behind him is his vision for how Edinburgh University is going to be redeveloped. And the Woolpack Inn is somewhere in there. Complete wanton vandalism and a complete breakdown of the idea of town and gown, in my opinion. And you know, he said to me, because I worked in his department, he said to me when I was complaining about what was going on, "Oh, you young people, you don't have any sense of what's modern and what's good. You're so stuck in the past." So, on the right is a couple of graphics that were produced in his name. The insertion of the urban motorway on the east side of Edinburgh and lacing its way across the Waverley station. This was an example of what the university was doing. So this is George Square, the Appleton Tower, a modernist, brutalist new building which Percy Johnson Marshall was so proud of, and in foreground the Georgian terrace in which I worked and which he worked, just standing there waiting for the wrecking ball. The other end of that terrace, the David Hume Tower, designed by Robert Matthew, who was Percy Johnson Marshall's sidekick. Incidentally, I'll tell a side story. There was a brief period when I was homeless, and so I had my mail redirected to the David Hume Tower, where they had a reception and a place where you could keep mail. And I received a letter from somebody, I can't remember what, taxman or something, saying, addressed to Mr. David H. Tower. So that's me. Yeah, and that's how it is more or less today. So the Edinburgh Plans were thwarted at a certain point, but not before the integrity of the Georgian townscape had been compromised. But we did have some successes. That Eastern Link Road, that motorway road, we campaigned against, and it was killed off, despite Buchanan's best efforts. We weren't just anti, we put forward a proposal for a tram on the diagram on the right there. Our proposal was built. Some gratification in that. At the time of all of this going on, I used to keep press cuttings, and I had a folder which I kept my press cuttings in, and I found it the other day in the loft. And I thought you might like to see it. That's how I saw the world at that time. So then back to London, and in the introduction was already mentioned J. Michael Thompson. He was a great inspiration to me. I read this book, Motorways in London, which came out in 1969, and when I saw a job came up at LSE, where Michael Thompson was then research fellow, I applied for that job, and he was on the interview panel, and apparently, I was told later, he insisted that I get the job, which I did. So I worked with Michael Thompson. I also worked under a pseudonym as the secretary of an organisation called the London Amenity and Transport Association, and this was the main antagonist, if you like, organisation against the proposal to lace London with ringways and radial motorways, which would have effectively finished the job that the Blitz had started. But there are other local campaigns as well, which I got involved with. One was the comprehensive redevelopment of Covent Garden, can you believe? The nature of which is sort of hinted at in that graphic on the right. And also Piccadilly Circus was going to be more or less demolished to make way for more traffic. At the time I was then working for Westminster City Council, and I was campaigning against the proposals of the city I was working for. So the pseudonym was quite handy. I don't care who knows now, to be honest. Okay, so just trying to draw some of this together. Here's what I call City Ideas timeline. This is the lifespan of the people that I've been talking about. And there was a period from about 1950 through to about 1975 where I would say the urban environment was subjected to brutalist mayhem. The plans were certainly there. They didn't all get built, but some did. And the worst bits of our towns and cities tend to be dating from that period. There was then, from about 1970 through to the late 80s, 90, a very strong reaction, a popular reaction, as well as a professional reaction against that way of doing things. And then, from about 1990 onwards, at least in terms of city centres and town centres, I think we've witnessed a complete turnaround, an emphasis on the Renaissance, a new Renaissance, placemaking, people-oriented planning, and so on. Not all successful, but compared with what we were looking at 40, 50 years ago, major improvements. And I am tempted to think of this as maybe calling it 2020 vision. We've got 2 years to go, but maybe that's... are we familiar with the term 2020 vision? Okay. So that's a strapline that could be marketed, perhaps. So there's just a few examples of the way in which things have improved. There's New Road in Brighton, which was a Jan Gale conversion. It was originally proposed for pedestrianisation. Jan Gale said, you don't need to do that. You can still allow access for vehicles, but let's make it pedestrian priority. And I think it works very well. Similar ideas going on is in New York, Times Square, which you probably know about. It's not reclaiming city space, it's actually claiming it because it was never available before for pedestrians on that sort of scale. And back home in London, this is how King's Cross used to look. I don't know if you can recall, but it was a product of the 1970s. Awful buildings in front of the wonderful original station building, and that forecourt is now available excuse me, as a public space. Here's Chatham, near where I grew up before, and the same space as it looks today. Okay, it's not an award-winning bit of townscape, but quite a different atmosphere, I'm sure you'll agree. But despite these improvements, we still have a big problem with our suburban experience. Excuse me. And I would just like to mention a new organisation called Transport for New Homes. Can you put your hand up if you've heard of this, please? Not everybody. Catch up with this fast, because this is really important. Okay, we get it in terms of placemaking and people-centred planning in historic centres, in town centres. We get all that now. Jan Gale and the likes have been promoting that for some years, and we understand it very clearly. But the new building of homes is pretty grim. And Transport for New Homes is aiming to try and change that. So, what about Lynch in the modern context? Are we still lynched? So, if Lynch's work was in the context of a hopefully defunct aspect of city evolution, what, if any, is his lasting legacy? I'm trying to sort of prime questions coming up. Awareness of the city structure? Yes, certainly. Influences on the structure? Promoting consideration of urban quality? Maybe. We can look at the national planning policy framework and find some warm-sounding words that new developments should be visually attractive and respond to character and history and maintain a strong sense of place. And I suppose, in summary, you could say those sorts of messages are what Lynch was trying to put forward. But let's have a look briefly now at a modern suburban environment. I attempted a Lynchian analysis of the Swindon ASDA. Here we are. At the back there's a line of trees and there's no apparent way forward, so presumably that's an edge. We have the path for the vehicles straight ahead and crossing a path for pedestrians from the parked cars into the store entrance. And maybe that store entrance provides some sort of nodal point, highlighted there by a litter bin and a lamppost. And maybe the building itself, in a sea of mediocrity, is in itself perhaps a landmark. It's clearly had an architect's hand on it, hasn't it? And this is the context. I thought, well, okay, I'm trying to do a Lynchian analysis on a very small piece of townscape. What if I try and do it for the broader area in which this ASDA sits? You can see quite clearly where it sits. It's the big hole where there's no internal streets. So the paths in this case are paths for cars. The edges presumably would be the back fences of houses that back onto the distributor roads, and the nodes would be roundabouts. So cars gather there, but people don't. Districts? Well, it's impossible to distinguish one of these sub-areas from another. And as far as I can make out, there are no landmarks. So what would Lynch have to say about this? He would say this is Boston South End writ large, completely lacking in identity, character, or form. But that's what we're building, folks. This is what Transport for New Homes is trying to get or persuade us against. So, what is his imageability legacy? My problem with the Lynch, what I call the Pendel Schema, is that it's very difficult to interpret on the ground. The elements that he identifies, yes, you can describe them, but they are not described in a qualitative way. They're factual. It's an edge, okay, it's an edge, but is it a good edge? Could it be a better edge? It also, there's only 5 elements, and it seems to me that's quite a constrained definition of the image of the city. It ignores, for example, sight, smell, sound, and tactile things which might contribute to image. And in my experience, has not been widely adopted, although many of you claimed that it had been used in your work. So that's quite interesting. I'd like to hear more about that in discussion. And so finally, Lynch's legacy, some questions. How useful are the Lynch methods? Is planning machinery capable of considering city form? Is the diversity of form the new normal? Or is it all about buildings, iconic buildings, rather than townscape as such? Number 5, does anyone care? And number 6, if they do, does the NPPF say enough? Thank you very much.